Can a person lose their sanity to such a degree that they would pick up a weapon and go take the lives of others? The story we'll tell today demonstrates that this does happen. It's hard to imagine a more brutal and senseless act of violence. How difficult it is to trust those around us when an ordinary resident of your neighborhood can turn out to be a real maniac, obsessed with bloodlust. It might seem that a terrible fate awaits hardened criminals or other scoundrels. However, in reality, innocent members of our community become the objects of special attention from those capable of the most horrific forms of cruelty. A girl named Shantay Blankenship was born in 1991. In her early years, doctors diagnosed her with mild intellectual disability. Despite this, the girl was able to enter middle school and successfully complete it. However, reading and writing skills remained inaccessible to her, except for a few simple words. Shantay had pronounced speech problems, couldn't drive a car, perform work duties, or live without constant supervision. The girl had disability status. Despite all the difficulties, Shantay made efforts to build her own life. As of 2016, the 25-year-old girl lived in the same house with her grandfather named Charlie and her boyfriend. The girl enjoyed listening to music and enthusiastically picked out nice things at the local shopping complex. She regularly attended church in their area and was a member of the church choir. Shantay grew up in a large family, having 7 brothers and sisters. Every family member treated her with great love and tried to protect her. Among Shantay's favorite activities were evening walks, which she took on the familiar streets of North Lake. This is a town in Texas, United States, where approximately 5,000 residents lived, and where the girl lived with her relatives. The town was small and quiet, residents knew each other, and life flowed measuredly without any special events. On May 13, 2016, in the evening hours, Shantay prepared for her usual walk before her night's rest. It was her habit to go out shortly before the sun began to hide behind the horizon, enjoy the sunset, and then return home. Such walks didn't last long, so relatives allowed her to go out alone without fear, although sometimes someone accompanied her. During such walks, the girl valued the opportunity to be alone with her thoughts and dreams. This evening, events unfolded differently than usual. When the sun began to descend toward the horizon, Shantay called her grandfather by phone and said she was near their home, next to the mailboxes on the road, and intended to return. From that place to home, it was literally a few minutes' walk, but despite the short distance, the 25-year-old girl never returned at the expected time. About 30 minutes passed, and grandfather Charlie felt worried. Shantay wasn't answering calls, so the man went outside and examined the surrounding area, but his granddaughter was nowhere to be found. After this, he got behind the wheel of his car and began driving around the neighborhood searching for Shantay. The man drove the girl's usual route, which was well known to him. However, he found no trace of his granddaughter, so he expanded the search area, driving around the entire district, calling the girl's friends and acquaintances, involving other relatives in the search. Even when morning came, they couldn't find the granddaughter, she was nowhere to be found. Anxiety intensified, so the decision was made to contact law enforcement with a missing person report. Learning that this concerned a person with intellectual disabilities who was characterized by excessive trust and naivety, police representatives took the situation with due seriousness. Law enforcement immediately began search operations, understanding the critical nature of the situation. Shantay couldn't independently meet her own life needs, required constant care and supervision. At the same time, the girl had no habit of wandering aimlessly or suddenly going in unknown directions. She was aware of her inability to cope with any tasks without outside help, which caused serious concern about possible danger. Most of all, grandfather and other relatives worried because the girl had a pleasant appearance and very delicate build, lacking the physical ability to defend herself. Her defenselessness could become bait for persons with criminal intentions. Everyone who knew Shantay characterized her as an extremely friendly and balanced person without any ill-wishers. The local community knew the girl well, so when information about her disappearance spread through town, a large group of volunteers immediately formed, ready to join the search efforts. Everyone wanted to help the Blankenship family. Although grandfather Charlie had outlined in detail the territory he had searched at night, this area was checked again in daylight, but no traces of Shantay were found. That same day, the search area was expanded to several kilometers from the missing girl's place of residence, but this brought no results. No news came for several days. Finally, the search zone included an old, half-ruined abandoned building built in Victorian style, located on several acres of land. Usually, this place was used by high school students for meetings, drinking alcohol, and entertainment away from parental supervision. The first from the search groups to arrive there were several of the girls' neighbors. Later, they described this location as the perfect place for a horror movie. The empty building was overgrown with vegetation. School children told scary legends about it. Some even claimed to have seen ghostly phenomena there. 2 days after Shantay's disappearance, all these fantasies were destined to be supplemented with real horror. The missing girl's neighbors approached the abandoned building. Directly behind the half-closed gates, they noticed something resembling strands of hair and a bright rubber bracelet. The ground near the entrance had car tire tracks. Approaching closer, the young people realized that on the ground lay a clump of torn-out hair with signs of blood. The hair color resembled the missing girl's hair color. Bloody traces led inside the courtyard toward the house, specifically to the basement. It was located a few meters from the entrance. Going around the basement from all sides, they found another bracelet, identical to the one found near the gate. Everyone knew that the girl had a habit of wearing exactly such jewelry. The neighbors needed considerable time to gather courage and descend to the basement, but there were no other representatives of the search group on the territory of the abandoned building, so there was nowhere to turn for help. Opening the door, they instantly saw a human body. The girl lay on the concrete stairs, positioned head down, wearing only a t-shirt. Directing the flashlight beam at the body, they saw that the head and face were completely covered in blood. On the steps nearby lay a blade from a lawn mowing device. The frightened neighbors immediately notified the police. Law enforcement representatives arrived at the scene. Identifying Shantay was accomplished without difficulty. There was no doubt that the girl had become the object of a brutal crime of a violent nature, but it remained a mystery how she had ended up in this place. Among her acquaintances, there was no one who could spend time in this location. The girl herself had never visited this territory, always avoiding the abandoned building. The forensic medical examiner determined that the cause of Shantay's death was blunt force trauma to the head. In addition to this, the victim suffered significant injuries to the neck and face. The nature of the injuries corresponded to marks from the mower blade found near the body. The victim was subjected to prolonged brutal beating. It seemed that the attacker wanted to make sure of her death. On the deceased's chest, they found a shoe print, and on the neck, signs of attempted strangulation. The attacker wasn't limited to just taking her life. The victim suffered sexual assault, and thanks to biological samples obtained during the autopsy, experts managed to create a DNA profile of the attacker. Information about the horrific crime shocked the local community, especially considering the fact that Shantay was an extremely peaceful and non-confrontational person. The girl's friendliness made it absolutely impossible to think that she could have harmed anyone. District residents perceived her as a friendly girl with developmental disabilities who constantly smiled and made efforts to lead a normal life. Taking into account the extreme brutality of the crime, investigators began a thorough check of the victim's immediate circle for possible motives. The girl's social circle was extremely limited. In fact, all her contacts were limited to the closest people. Despite this, police officers conducted interviews with all men from her circle. Each of them provided biological samples for DNA analysis, but no matches were found. The victim's boyfriend was at work in a food establishment on the day of the tragedy. After confirming his alibi, he was excluded from the list of possible suspects. The rest of the acquaintances also had convincing evidence of their non-involvement. All persons who knew the deceased and maintained contact with her were methodically checked and excluded. After completing this stage, the search circle for the potential criminal was significantly expanded. Interviews began with persons who had past episodes of sexual violence and lived in the county. The total number of persons who underwent interrogation and verification exceeded 100. Numerous suspects underwent polygraph testing. Approximately 30 men agreed to provide biological samples for comparison with the DNA found on Shantay's body. However, no matches were found. The investigation reached a dead end after the genetic profile obtained was entered into the federal database, but the system returned no matches. This meant that the person responsible for the girl's death had no prior convictions, and they also couldn't identify anyone with potential motives for committing the attack and murder. After involving the public in the investigation process and data collection, numerous reports from citizens began to arrive, each of which was subject to thorough verification due to the absence of other leads in the case. Among the reports were even extremely unusual stories, but the level of their absurdity didn't affect the thoroughness of verification. One witness claimed to have seen Shantay getting into an unknown person's car, providing a detailed description of the vehicle. However, such a car couldn't be found in the state. Another woman reported that her former partner, while intoxicated, had boasted about killing a mentally disabled girl. Yet another witness claimed that her ex-husband belonged to an occult group, and Shantay had become a victim of ritual murder. All checks proved fruitless. Later, it was assumed that these women were simply trying to get revenge on their former partners. None of the many reports coming to the police station led to obtaining useful information. The initial enthusiasm gradually waned. The number of calls constantly decreased. For several months, no progress was observed. The investigation remained in this state for a whole year. When the first anniversary of Shantay's tragic death arrived, the church where she sang in the choir and which she regularly attended organized a memorial service in honor of the victim of the unknown criminal. This event reminded the community that the guilty party was still at large. Besides the fact that his bloody deed remained unpunished, there was a threat of a repeat attack. This caused a renewal of public interest in the case. A local publication published material that again examined the circumstances of the case, laying out all information available to the public. The publication also reminded about the established reward of $5,000 for a person who would provide information for the arrest of the killer. However, even this initiative didn't lead to progress in the investigation. The breakthrough came after a year and a bit. One evening, one of the detectives involved in investigating Shantay's case, while watching a television program, learned about a new technology called DNA phenotyping. The next morning, he shared with colleagues the idea of possibly using this method to solve the crime. At first, most expressed doubts about the unfamiliar technology. However, due to the lack of alternative directions for investigation, it was decided to establish contact with the Parabon company. At the initial stage, the sheriff who was leading the search for the criminal planned only to conduct a consultation with the company's management to assess the feasibility of financial expenses. The company representative provided contact details for several detectives who had already used their services and achieved success in cases that hadn't yielded to traditional methods for years. The sheriff established contact with these investigators, who recommended trying the technology. At that time, the success rate of the method was about 50%. Considering the absence of alternative investigation options, such a probability seemed sufficiently encouraging. A serious obstacle at that moment was the financial side of the issue, as significant funds had already been spent on investigating Shantay's murder. Conducting analysis in a specialized laboratory required additional expenses of $3,600. Unfortunately, the police department didn't have such a sum at their disposal at that time. In connection with this, the sheriff's office approached the prosecutor's office with a proposal to send samples for research on the condition that half the cost would be covered by the district attorney, who at that time was Michael Murray. Receiving the sheriff's proposal, the district attorney also had doubts, as he knew little about the proposed methodology. Considering the additional costs, the 50% probability of success no longer looked so convincing. A month after this conversation, an annual conference took place. At the event, they again touched on the topic of DNA phenotyping in an informal atmosphere. The sheriff was the biggest optimist among them and eventually convinced Michael Murray to finance half the cost of services. Having received consent, samples from the victim's body were sent to the laboratory. The company from Reston, Virginia, engaged not only in DNA phenotyping but also in genetic genealogy, but due to the limited budget in Shantay's case, they decided to use only the first technology. The essence of this method is that based on available samples, a kind of computer composite sketch is generated. Using this technology, it's possible to predict a person's features from their DNA profile. For this, an approximate photo is created. Data from a large database of volunteers who provided their DNA and detailed face scans is used. Parole proceeds from the fact that most traits are hereditary. Having a large database of genetic markers, it's possible to recreate the criminal's appearance from a sample of his DNA with high accuracy. Of course, the accuracy isn't perfect. First of all, this is statistical prediction, but it allows determining with high probability the natural hair color, eyes, skin, presence and even number of freckles, basic facial features. In addition, algorithms detect origin, racial characteristics, which are correspondingly reflected in the appearance of the generated 3D image. The developers of this technology themselves claim that it's most effective when you need to exclude suspects from a list or obtain an approximate image of unknown human remains. But there are nuances. For example, with a limited amount of material, the accuracy of determining external features significantly decreases. The method has been actively criticized by lawyers and human rights defenders. And today they appeal to the fact that a person can influence their appearance through their lifestyle. For example, gain excess weight or systematically use alcohol which will negatively affect appearance and can significantly change it. However, DNA phenotyping isn't such a precise tool, but rather allows obtaining additional information where it's lacking, or conversely, discarding excess. Law enforcement became convinced of Parabon's capabilities from their own experience. They were ready to provide at least some data, even if only 1 nanogram of the criminal's DNA remained, so the sample from Shantay's body was sent to the laboratory with hope of advancing the case. After receiving the portrait, they planned to take a new look at the list of previously dismissed suspects. The county sheriff and the victim's family waited with bated breath for the results. Receiving the report took a month. According to the data, the profile carrier was a male of Northern European descent with light or very light skin. His eyes were from blue to green shades, but not dark, hair, from brown to light, but not black. With a 33% probability, he had several freckles, and the visual image was generated based on an age of about 25 years. Then the computer portrait was published on the sheriff's office social media page. The search for the unknown person began. In addition, it was shown to the deceased's family. One of the younger brothers immediately stated that the portrait looked like Ryan Ricks. And indeed, the resemblance was striking. The boy was a neighbor and former classmate of this young man. At the time the image was received, Ryan had turned 21. He had no criminal record. He had never been involved in violent criminal episodes, but turned out to be acquainted with Shantay's family, as he lived a few houses away. He didn't maintain close relations with them. It seemed incredible that an ordinary neighborhood boy could be capable of brutal murder. When police officers tried to meet and talk with Ryan Ricks, it turned out he was nowhere to be found. His parents said they didn't know where he was. For several days, searches yielded no results. They assumed the boy had left town. To facilitate his detention, they needed to declare him wanted. But for this, the portrait resemblance alone wasn't enough. Detectives tried to find at least some offense. And they managed to find out that the main suspect had once thrown trash in an unauthorized place. This allowed them to issue a warrant for charges of illegal waste dumping. The young man was still absent. They couldn't find him at home or at work. Therefore, suspicions arose that he had fled. The parents reported they hadn't seen him for over a week. But at the same time, he had appeared at home once when no one was there. Ryan left a note apologizing for missing his mother's birthday. And left $20 as a gift. Finally, 6 days after the police communicated with the Ricks family, the prodigal's son returned. On November 15, 2018, Ryan came home to his parents and told them something horrific. Then, together with them, he went to the same church that Shantay attended, and sometimes he himself. The young man wasn't particularly religious, but recent events in his life had broken something in him. Therefore, he saw faith as the last hope for salvation. He met with the priest and stated that he wanted to confess before the local residents to killing the girl from the church choir. He was repentant and wanted to fix everything as much as possible. The priest agreed to allow him to speak, but immediately said that after this he would call the county sheriff. Ryan stated there was no need for this, as immediately after the service he would go to the station himself and make a confession. The young man came to the service and confessed to the murder before the parishioners, but didn't mention the rape. Many present gasped, shocked by his words, and several people even came out of the crowd, hugged him and stated they forgave him. Immediately after this, without waiting for the police to arrive, Ryan, together with his parents, went to the county sheriff. Here, for 2 hours, Ryan Ricks gave a confession, but to the detective's surprise, it was a businesslike and calm conversation. The criminal told how he knew Shantay, like everyone in their local community. She had mental retardation, so he chose her as an easy target. The heroine of the story was small, delicate and wouldn't put up proper resistance. He met her near the mailboxes when she was calling her grandfather and was about to go home. The criminal decided to take action. He arrived in his own pickup truck and invited the girl to have fun together. Shantay was familiar with him and had no suspicions about his horrific plans, so without hesitation took a seat in the car. The man drove her to a place with a view of the lake, where an observation point was located. At this place, he began making advances, but the girl supposedly didn't perceive the neighbor's hints, explaining this by having a boyfriend. After Ryan stated his intention to return her home, he instead directed the car to a deserted area, where he attacked and began strangling her in the front passenger seat. Shantay resisted while he forcefully squeezed her neck, but she couldn't scream loudly. When the victim lost consciousness, the attacker undressed her and committed sexual assault. Later, Ryan decided to destroy the evidence while the girl was unconscious but still alive. He transported her to the abandoned Victorian-era building, whose location he knew. The attacker dragged the victim inside and left her on the basement stairs, but didn't stop there. He returned to the vehicle, took out a mower blade and began striking her skull and face. This was a conscious action, as he wanted to make Shantay's survival and testimony against him to law enforcement impossible. The criminal put his foot on the victim's chest and held it there for some time to finally deprive her of the ability to breathe and cause her to choke on blood. After this, Ryan took the deceased's smartphone, deactivated it, drove several kilometers away and disposed of the device. In his confession, he summed up that he really intended to commit murder and a sexual crime, explaining this by having a certain dark part of his personality that craves destruction and evil. On that tragic day, this dark part won, and he was powerless to resist it. According to Ryan Ricks' words, after committing this act, he felt fear of exposure and decided to keep a low profile. The young man joined the search efforts, tracked the progress of the investigation, was present at the funeral ceremony, cried along with other community residents and expressed grief, understanding that he was lucky to remain undetected. The boy tried to continue existing, but over time he began to be tormented by pangs of conscience. After the composite image created using the phenotyping method appeared on the sheriff's website, Ryan recognized his own features and felt frightened, trying to avoid law enforcement. At that moment, the killer was thinking about but couldn't carry out this intention and began a dialogue with the Almighty. In the process of this communication, enlightenment occurred, and he realized the need to confess to what he had done. At the same time, he primarily intended to come with repentance to the temple to give himself into the hands of the Creator. Only after this did he plan to surrender to representatives of the law. When asked what punishment he considered adequate for himself, Ryan answered that it was, without a doubt, the death penalty. After this, investigators continued communication with the suspect and tried to obtain additional information about his life story. The man reported long-term use of narcotic substances. Mental disorders had occurred in his family. The offender even gave to understand that in childhood he had suffered sexual abuse from a family member, but didn't elaborate. He claimed that during the commission of the crime he wasn't under the influence of psychoactive substances. In his opinion, he suffered from certain serious psychological disorders. Before the attack on Shantay, he had several times tried to drown his own pet, a dog, in a bucket of water, and also attempted suicide. The young man provided a biological sample from his oral cavity for comparing the genetic profile, which turned out to be identical to the biomaterials found on Shantay's body. While giving testimony, he was in a completely sober state, had full understanding of what was happening. He quite rationally analyzed his own actions, even from a legal perspective, realizing that sexual intercourse without consent is rape. Overall, the young man appeared competent, although this confession was extraordinary by all criteria. The investigation established that in the past Ryan had stolen a firearm from his neighbor and tried to use it for suicide. As a result, he ended up in a psychiatric facility for several days. The young man was diagnosed with depressive disorder. According to doctors' conclusions, he had no mental illnesses. All this happened at 16 years of age due to difficulties in a relationship with a girl. Ryan underwent brief therapy, but even after this, medical documentation about mental disorders wasn't recorded. The young man had minor problems at the educational institution related to violations of behavioral rules, minor offenses, but nothing significant or related to violence. Numerous acquaintances characterized him as a calm, though closed person. However, no one assumed that Ryan was capable of taking the life of an innocent girl. Studying the young man's biography, law enforcement tried to determine whether to insist on the highest measure of punishment. The defenders planned to build a defense strategy based on insanity, seeking to achieve mitigation of the sentence and save Ryan Ricks from execution. Much was determined by whether the jury would consider the admission of guilt and demonstration of repentance as a mitigating circumstance. At the time of the described events, Shantay's grandfather, Charlie, had turned 87 years old. Police representatives decided to obtain detailed testimony from him. Despite the fact that outwardly he looked in satisfactory health and had plans to live even to 110 years old, other representatives of the Blankenship family noted that his granddaughter's death had significantly affected his condition. The grandfather described in detail her existence, living conditions, and care for Shantay, as she had lived with him for most of her life. Recording the testimony turned out to be a good decision, as just a few months later Charlie had a stroke. Many people were convinced that it was Ryan's criminal act that caused irreparable harm. The grandfather himself, after contact with government representatives, admitted that he was shaken to the deepest fibers of his soul to be in the same room with the killer. Shortly before the preliminary hearings, which were scheduled for September 2019, Ryan's defense representatives announced their client's desire to make an official statement. He expressed readiness to plead guilty to first-degree murder, which carries the death penalty, on the condition that the state would waive the highest measure. Shantay's relatives considered this proposal, gave consent and concluded that life imprisonment without the possibility of parole would be adequate punishment. After 3 years filled with tears, they only wanted this story to end. They agreed to a guilty plea and waiver of appeals instead of hearings and countless appeals that would inevitably follow. On February 15, 2019, Ryan Ricks, within the framework of the reached agreement, pleaded guilty in court. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Shantay Blankenship's mother delivered an emotional address at the end of the process, after which tears appeared in the eyes of everyone present in the courtroom. At the end of this difficult day, a photo of Shantay was posted on a social platform, showing her sitting by a body of water and having fun with her smartphone. The text on the image proclaimed, "I have achieved justice." At the beginning of 2025, the owner of the abandoned building decided to demolish the structure, which attracted unwanted public attention to this case. He hired a contracting organization that performed the work in April 2025, destroying all the heavy memories of this house. Please write your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. For those who are new here, subscribing is the best way to stay updated on future content. Also give a like please. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Thank you for your support during this difficult time. Until next time, friends.